So yeah, hello, I'm Andrew. I'm one of the authors of the xAPI specification. I also work as a consultant with Watershed LRS, which is a commercial learning record store. I've really enjoyed being with you guys at this conference this week. Most of the work we do is actually in industry, it's not in an academic environment. And I feel that there's a lot that I've learned that I'm going to take back. And the two case studies I'm sharing with you today are also more from industry than academia, and I hope that you'll learn from the crossovers. There's certainly some similarities and also some differences. I think probably the biggest difference I've noticed is whether data are plural or if it's singular. So apologies if I get that wrong. Thank you for laughing. So the first case study is CRS, Catholic Relief Services. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you've been deployed to this situation, this disaster situation in Haiti, to assess the needs of a community. In this case, the disaster is an earthquake. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of uncertainty going on. You've had some training, but has that training sufficiently prepared you for this situation? Now imagine another scenario. You're not the person who's on the ground, you're responsible for creating the training. How can you be sure that the training you're creating is going to prepare people for this situation? And that's the situation that CRS find themselves in. They're an organisation founded after the Second World War to help people affected by that particular disaster. And since then, they've grown. They've got almost 100 million people in 93 countries across 5 continents, which I think is most of the continents covered there. And so they send emergency response teams, or in fact they have teams ready in places where there may be a disaster, and they serve in the case of a disaster like this. And for CRS, it's really important that training is good, particularly perhaps more than other organisations. They're in a scenario where the stakes are very high, that it's a life or death situation. The clock is ticking. They've got to help people quickly. These are first responders that we're talking about, the people that get there right after the disaster's happened. So that they've got a limited time window to make a difference. It's very hard work. There's a lot to do. It's very complex work. And there's no chance to redo it. If they we got that earthquake wrong, we'll do better next time. No, they've got to get it right first time. So in this scenario, the training really is important. One last one. The emergencies are rare. So for a lot of people, I imagine, I don't have solid information on this, but I imagine that it may be their first time responding to the emergency. Certainly it's not something that they're doing every week. And so for CRS, apologies, changing laptop has obviously messed up my formatting a little bit. But for CRS, this is what they said. It's important that they have useful data to make decisions about our staff and improve how we do training. This helps us identify whether people are applying what they learned during training and how we can change support before they get deployed. So that was why this was important for CRS. Their actual program looked a little bit like this. They have kind of 2 stages, I suppose. Firstly, there's the stuff that happens before people are deployed, and then there's the stuff that happens actually on deployment, when a disaster has happened and people go into this situation. And in terms of the progress of the project, the first stage is happening now, it's happening. The second stage, they've got the technology in place, but they haven't actually used it yet, so we don't have data from that stage as yet. So in the first stage, they have this simulation that people complete, and they do this before and after some classroom training. So you'd hope you'd see an improvement between the simulation before and the simulation afterwards. In the classroom, they're also assessed. They've got a teacher who's observing them. And then when they actually go on a deployment, they have a self-assessment that they complete, and they also have an observer assessment for when they're actually interacting in the situation. So we're going to look at these various different data sources in a little bit more detail. There's some screenshots of the simulation there. And actually, rather than showing you that slide, I'm going to jump forward a couple of slides and we'll come back. If you'd like to try the simulation, you can scan that QR code or type that link in and you can actually give it a go. The simulation was developed by a company called Learning Ninjas. It uses a product called Articulate Storyline, and it was actually then customized by another consultant who added additional xAPI tracking. So what I like about this project, it was a number of different vendors involved to bring all the data together. I've forgotten my other bullet points, so I'm actually going to have to go back. So, in fact, no, I said everything, so that's good. The actual scenario is basically CRS have this idea that there's one ideal path, and that people either deviate to being too lax in interacting with people on the ground or being too harsh. So they're often dealing with people like community leaders and that sort of thing. You know, are they putting people off by being too strong, or are they just saying, you know, oh, we don't really mind what you do? And they're the kind of deviations that they can make. And there's one ideal path kind of down the middle. So there's lots of different branches that people can take, and they deviate from those branches. And so the questions that can be asked there are, how much does the learner deviate? So look at the learner, but also which steps have the most deviation, which are the areas that maybe we need to do a bit more training on. As I said, if you didn't quite get to snap it, I'll leave that up for a second. I'll give you, I can see Will that's snapping, so. Perfect. So we have the scenario. We also have a checklist application. This is used by the trainer in the classroom. So the questions there are, you know, does classroom performance match the performance as measured by the assessment simulation? And if it doesn't match, is it a valid assessment, or is it that what's been doing in the classroom doesn't match up? It's important that what they've been taught in the classroom is aligned to what's been assessed in the simulation. And then it's also used, or it will be used, or the plan is to use it, by the learner and the observer on deployment. And so the questions there are, do the confidence of the person who's been deployed and their actual performance match their performance as indicated by the assessment? Is it a good assessment for making sure that people are ready for deployment? And also, what's the impact of changes in training on performance? If they make a tweak to the classroom course or they change the assessment, how does that affect what they're actually doing when they're on the ground? So how do we collect this data, especially in disaster zones that may not have internet? Well, the obvious answer, since you're in the xAPI stream, is that we use the Experience API. And the sentence that I use to talk about xAPI isn't the one that Kirsty crossed out, luckily. It's that xAPI is a shared language for two systems to talk about what a person does. It's a way of learning systems communicating about learning. So why should CRS use xAPI? Why should you use xAPI? Well, the great benefit of xAPI is about bringing all the data in one place. It's not just the LMS data, it's not just the social media data, it's all the data that you're interested in, bringing it together in one place in a common format to make it easier to use. It means that you can plug into existing learning technology products. So on this product, they used Articulate Storyline that already had some xAPI support. They used Watershed Learning Record Store to handle the data, which again already supported xAPI. So you're not having to reinvent the wheel. There's loads and loads of open source code libraries and other resources online. It's very easy to get started. My favourite blog post about xAPI was a guy who spent about half a day reading up on it. Then he put a pizza in his oven and decided to have a go at actually implementing it. Before the pizza was cooked, he had sent his first bit of data using xAPI. So it really is very easy to get started with, and there's lots of help available. You can avoid vendor lock-in because it's a standard thing. I think this is a significant thing that's not often mentioned. You know, if you've ever had to move learner data from one learning management system, maybe Moodle to Blackboard or something like that, it's not easy. And in fact, it's probably impossible in some cases. For the hackathon earlier this week, we had 4 different learning record store vendors that connected up their products. And it was very easy. It was something we did for a hackathon. Nobody paid for that. We just set the configuration and set it off. So it's very easy to move your data from one system to another. Kirsty mentioned SCORM. Compared to SCORM, xAPI is a modern specification. It supports offline tracking. It supports tracking real-world activities. It's not just about e-learning courses in the LMS. And as Kirsty mentioned several times, it's an open standard that's developed, debated, tested by an open community. Anybody can come and challenge and criticize and contribute and make a pull request, We would welcome, if any of you want to be involved in the development of the xAPI specification, please get involved. So we get the data out with xAPI. I'm now going to show you some pretty slides with Watershed and talk to you about some of the reports. If any of you want a demo of Watershed, I'm very happy to show you that afterwards, but I'll just very briefly go through some of these. So one of the questions in the assessment is, who do you want on your team? There's a particular scenario that you're going into. Your team members have certain strengths and weaknesses. Which ones are you going to pick? And so this visualization is looking just at that question. Obviously, it's a bar chart with some pretty colors. Red means it's an incorrect choice. Green means it's a correct choice. So we can see not just how many people got it right, but how did they get it wrong? How did they get it right? Which are the team members that they're selecting incorrectly? So that information can be used to inform the training. This one's looking at which steps people trip up on. So in this particular case, step 2, nobody got that right. So that's an area that, again, should be looked at in the training. And I was particularly pleased that they mentioned the pheromone analysis, which I'd never heard of in the keynote yesterday. I think actually it's kind of what we're doing here. So I'm going to definitely pinch that name. If you see that springing up in corporate learning conferences, it started here. And then again, another one looking at how people navigate a path. So each of those lines there is an individual student, so you can see the different students moving through. So some lessons learned. We asked CRS what lessons they learned from the project, and these are their answers. They said actually for convincing stakeholders that xAPI is a good idea is quite a hard thing to do. If you can make a demo, that makes it easier. Deciding what data you need to capture is hard. This is exactly what Kirsty was saying. Start with a data model, work out what you want to capture, and then go and do it. Don't just capture everything. And also, it's about looking at what's got the highest return. So I encourage people to think, when they're thinking about what they want to track, to first say, if you had unlimited budget, what would you want to track? And kind of brainstorm those, and then come back to those and say, okay, well, we don't have unlimited budget. What's the highest value things compared to the cost? And weighing up both of those things. If you just look at the cost, you end up with the street lamp analogy where you're looking where the light shines, and if you just look at the value, you run out of budget fairly quickly. Another thing they learned, it's okay to get help. I already mentioned there's lots of help available. And then finally, their takeaway was that this is possible. Although they haven't got to the end of the project yet, so slightly ironic on there, but they were able to get very far, and hopefully they will finish the project. And one final thing is that pilots are great. So in fact, this was something mentioned in the keynote. Iterate on what you're doing. Start with something and then iterate. Another question that I think this project illustrates is the dilemma between build or buy. And just to be clear here, I'm not talking about open source versus closed source, because this applies just as much to, do you go and build your own open source thing, or do you buy into what's already happening in open source? So for CRS, they used Articulate Storyline, an off-the-shelf product, and then they customized it with additional tracking. Articulate Storyline did most of what they needed, but they were able to then develop it further to get it to do exactly what they needed. In this case, the checklist application was custom built because at the time, there wasn't really anything available. Today, if you wanted to do stuff with a checklist, I'd recommend a product by a company called Training Evidence Systems out of Australia. They have an excellent checklist that outputs really nice xAPI statements. So for CRS, it was the right decision to build at the time, but now there is a product available. So kind of some summary there. Off-the-shelf tools generally faster and cheaper to get and maintain, but if it doesn't do exactly what you need, some custom development can be helpful. So that's the end of that first session. And I want to kind of open up to questions, not just about what I've talked about. If you've got any general questions about xAPI that are, not that related to the case study that I talked about, I'm very happy to take those as well.
And can you back up to the QR code?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You have no question about it, what?
It's quite a lot of slides. Here we are. I think we knew that. There we are.
Any questions to Andrew at that point? Christy, you need to take the mic, Dragan said, because...
So back to the reporting, for example, how much have you looked at what people are looking at in the dashboard there, right? So, you know, one of our big dilemmas is always, you know, how do I give people things that they actually find useful? And so you can make nice, pretty bar charts and, you know, maps and like the map one is a really good example. Do people actually understand that, or you know, do they just sort of look at it and go, "Oh, pretty," and then not really use it? Like, have you thought about that much at all as an organisation?
So in terms of thought about it, absolutely. In terms of done anything about it, not really. So we kind of had this idea about tracking really everything that people do in Watershed to get that kind of analysis, and I think that would be really interesting. And we got as far as tracking logged in and logged out, which seems to be a classic starting point, which isn't really that interesting. And I guess other priorities have come in, so that's not something that it's not on our roadmap, but if someone was really interested in it and paid us, then I'm sure it would be on our roadmap.
Any more questions at that point? Comments? Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you recommend any resources for someone taking their first steps in xAPI, or online, or books, or whatever?
So there's a website you can go to. It's called experienceapi.com. You can also go to tincanapi.com, which is exactly the same website but with a different logo. Don't ask about why there's two names. We won't get into that. So that website has got a lot of resources on it. I'm slightly biased because I wrote a whole bunch of it, but I think it's a helpful website. It's split up into 4 different sections where there's like an introductory section, there's a section specifically about getting started, how can you get started, and then there's pages for instructional designers and pages for developers, and there's a bunch of links on there. Just Googling xAPI, you probably find a bunch of other resources. The ADL do have a resources page that has some useful stuff on it. Try xAPI, yeah, there's some great case studies and things on there. There's something called Connections Forum, and they have a whole bunch of blogs and newsletters, and they run these events called xAPI Camp. There was one in London last week, so you've missed out on that one if you're in the UK, but there's several planned in the US for next year. So that there's information there. There's a thing called xAPI Cohorts that used to be run by ADL, but it's now kind of passed on to the community, and there's a company called Torrance Learning that are kind of shepherding that effort at the moment. There's lots of stuff that you can find. And the other thing is, if you want to grab my card at the end, I'm very happy to take questions and, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, any other questions? Or even, maybe not questions, if anyone is doing something with xAPI and wants to kind of briefly mention what they're doing, and I'll comment on it, hopefully intelligently.
Anyone? Well, actually, I have 2.
Okay.
Well, one thing is you said it was very easy to export from one LRS to the other, the data. And I don't know, a year ago or something, I found a paper where they tried it, and I think it was also Watershed sheet, and then that you said it was not that easy to get the data from the LRS to the other LRS. There's a paper somewhere on the ThinkCan page.
Okay, so I wrote that. Let me explain. It was
a very honest paper. Well, I thought, okay.
Yeah. Thank you. So this was probably a couple of years ago now, and the xAPI specification version 1 was released on April. In fact, it's probably about 3 years old today, or a couple of days ago or something. It was April 2013. I think it was the 23rd. So when the specification was initially released, lots of people decided to develop learning record stores. The Watershed was one of those. Learning Locker, they've got a stand out there, and Ben's over there if you want to talk about Learning Locker. Watershed LRS is another kind of prominent one. And there are several LRSs, and obviously they developed their implementations in reference to the specification. But at that point, there was no conformance testing, and it was developers working in isolation. And so I was given the task of, basically trying to figure out if xAPI really did work in practice. So I contacted the various vendors, got access to Learning Locker and to Wax LRS. I was working for the company producing Watershed, so obviously had access to that, and just gave it a go. I set up a Moodle instance, had e-learning courses launched from Moodle, feeding data into, I think they were feeding data into Learning Locker, and then pulling data out of Learning Locker into Watershed, and then pushing data into Wax LRS. And also I had data going into Wax LRS and then pulling back into Watershed as well. So I tried to set up a two-way link and a one-way link for the data, just to make it realistic. And the first time I set it up, it didn't work. I can't remember the details. You have to go and look at the white paper, but pulling the data from Learning Locker didn't work. I think pulling the data from Wax into Watershed worked. Essentially everything else didn't. So figured out why it didn't work. Passed in, there were bugs in all three learning record stores as far as I remember. Gave data to information to each of the vendors. They worked on it independently for about a month. It wasn't like a real close collaboration. It was like, here's the issues, go and fix those issues, and then we came back. And then when we came back, it worked. Now, this is an ongoing thing. Recently, for example, Watershed, we changed the way we pull statements. We had been requesting statements I'll just explain the technical terms because I can't think how to simplify it. We've been pulling statements in one way, requesting application JSON, and we decided that we wanted to make sure we were always getting any attachments attached to statements. So we were always going to pull statements using a different format, multi-part mixed format. So we made a reasonably significant change into how we were pulling statements. That didn't cause any problems with pulling statements from Wax. There were a couple of tweaks we had to make when we were developing that on our side, because we hadn't necessarily done it right the first time as we were developing it. Picked up one issue in Learning Locker and was able to submit an issue there, and I assume that'll be fixed in the next version of Learning Locker. And obviously we found issues on our own side as we were developing it. So it is something that we're continually keeping an eye on. And it's not necessarily always going to be smooth from an LRS vendor perspective, but we're finding the issues and we're dealing with them. And as I said, the hackathon on Monday, we did have 4 different LRSs connected together.
All right, cool.
You said you had 2 questions. You come back to
I give it to Alan.
Okay.
He has more important questions, and then we go with your second presentation.
It's more of a statement. It's more of an emperor statement. No, that's a joke. It's also the documentation. So the different learning record stores had examples, and in the hackathon we sort of had this really nice PhD student throw the statements at the learning record stores, and there's some little glitches. So it's not just about the data, it's about the information out there. So the idea is from the hackathon, the feedback from the hackathon was we'll do some kind of conformance test and then put all the examples out there into the conformance test. Did that sort of make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a project probably about 2 years ago now where Rusty Software got 1 million interns, not sure it's the exact number, to work on this project to develop a conformance test suite. That was then released, and actually at the same time, or a little bit after, this organisation called Riptide developed or released their own internal conformance test suite. So there are 2 conformance test suites at the moment, neither of which are complete, and neither of which claim to be complete. And honestly, both of them have really been neglected since they've been released. So if anyone wants to do work on the conformance test suite, going back to that build or buy thing, I'd encourage get involved in these existing, pick one of them and drive that forwards rather than starting again from scratch.